and that's right here. Okay. This is the normal cost curve. It's more or less U-shaped. And what he points out here is that the competitive price will be at 5 there, okay, where cost, including foregone interest on the capital invested, is returned to the investor. That is, he's earning a normal profit at $5. But he's able, because of the inelasticity of his demand curve, to raise the price to 9. But remember, he has to produce less than 9,000 units. He can only produce, let's say, 5,000 units, which corresponds to a price of 9. Okay, that's his maximum profit area. Okay, or that's his maximum profit quantity and price. Okay, now we come to Mises. Okay. Given that we've had, given that there was a very sophisticated theory of monopoly developed by the early 1930s, okay, what did Mises add to this? Okay. Well, Mises, basically, his whole point was to resuscitate this theory or revive it in human action, because in the 1930s it was swept away with all other Mengerian price theory. Okay. By 1940, when his German version of human action came out, people, or the profession as a whole, had all gone over to the monopolistic competition revolution. They had all been affected by it. They all believed that monopoly simply existed when there was a downwards, or monopoly power existed when there was a downward sloping demand curve, and when you had a few less than hundreds of thousands of sellers in a market. Okay. What's interesting is that in his chapter on prices and human action, there are 5 sections on monopoly price that take up half of the section on prices. There's 70 pages on prices and 35 is on monopoly price. So what Mises is trying to do is to survey and to refine the theory of monopoly price that developed from Menger to Mund. Okay. One thing I want to point out before I go into Mises is that we don't give him enough credit for his theory of monopoly price. Okay, he did make some improvements in it, and the reason why we don't do that is because we're looking back at his theory through Rothbardian analytical glasses. In other words, Mises made this horrible error, or so we think, of claiming that there could, in certain very limited circumstances, be a monopoly price on the market, whereas Rothbard showed that in fact there could not be. Okay, and Mises did in fact make that error. But that doesn't mean we should ignore his monopoly price theory, because Rothbard's develops right out of that. Okay, it really just takes a slight correction to get the right theory. Also, we tend to look at Mises' theory as a predecessor of Kerzner's theory, in which he believes that there can be, in again limited circumstances, a monopoly that emerges on the free market. Okay, Mises, in an article that he wrote in the 1940s, but was not published until the late 1990s in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, sets out the following very, very simple schedule. Okay, Mises almost never has tables, schedules, or graphs in any of his works. This is one of the few times that he does. Okay, and basically you see that his theory of monopoly price is exactly Menger's. All right. But he makes it a little bit more, he deepens it a little bit. But let me just look at this as a copper market. Let me just show you superficially what the theory says. Mises holds that if there's a copper mine, or a single company, okay, and it owns a number of copper mines, and it completely exploits its copper mine, the price will be $5 per pound, and the production will be 100 million pounds of copper. The total revenue of the firm will be $500 million. All right. Now, what Mises says is this: how do we know that $5 is the competitive price? He says $5 is the competitive price because in the marginal mine, in the least efficient copper mine, okay. Now we're talking about competition. So you have all these different firms. But the least efficient copper mine, that $5 will just cover the wages for labor and the interest on the investment of capital. There'll be nothing left over for the rent of that least efficient copper mine. So he says that you know that you have a competitive situation when production is such that you've pushed it to the point where the last units of the good produced just covers the non-specific factors. That is the laborers and the capital, which could be taken away and invested in other areas. Okay? Now, if one person owned all those mines, that person would restrict production. Okay? Now we're talking about or restrict, in this case, the amount he brings to the market. Let's say, for whatever reason, he's produced 100 million tons. Right? What he would do is restrict it so that his total revenue would rise from $500 million to a level that's higher than that. And notice, that could be at a price of $10, where you're only selling about 52 or 53 million tons, or it could be at $7, where you're selling 75 million tons. The monopolist would be indifferent between those two prices, $7 or $10, because given that his costs are sunk, that's what maximizes his revenue at $525 million. So now, why is this bad for society, according to Mises? It's bad for society because there are non-specific factors, labor and so on, that have been forced out of producing copper to producing goods that have a lower value to consumers. Okay? How does Mises prove that? He says, well, in fact, if you had more than one owner, or if you had more than one copper firm competing here, you would have more labor coming into the area from the lower wage areas that they've been forced into, and copper output would expand from 52 million to 100 million. That tells him that labor is misallocated, is producing lower valued goods for consumers. Okay, does everyone see that point? So, in a competitive situation, Mises says that the specific factors, the diamond mine, the wheat field, and so on, will be exploited to the point where the last unit of the specific factor has zero rent. Okay? The price will be high enough to cover the labor and the capital invested. And there'll be a zero rent return to the mine, to the forest, if we're talking about a lumber company, and so on. All right, now let's talk a little bit about what the other things that Mises says here. He says, in what situation is there a situation in which there would be too much production? He says, certainly there would be here. He says, at $4, the firm would be losing money. Okay, firms would be losing money because they wouldn't even be covering the cost of wages per unit, per pound of copper, and the interest. Okay, so restricting supply from 115 to 100 benefits society because you're allowing laborers that have a higher value elsewhere to go elsewhere and produce higher value products to consumers. Okay. He's saying, therefore, just because you've left part of your mine unused doesn't mean you're monopolizing. Okay. Let's say you've built a factory that's too big and you only are using half of the factory space to produce automobiles. Let's say in the 1980s, when the demand for large cars fell because of the high price of gasoline. In that situation, it was rational to cut back on the number of cars you were producing. Because the prices were so low, they weren't even covering the wages of labor and the investment in the raw materials. So Mises says that just because you've restricted supply doesn't imply monopoly. What implies monopoly is that if you restrict supply above the zero rent margin, okay, if laborers go to places that have lower value, that is, that their marginal revenue product is lower. Now, he says, what are the necessary preconditions for the emergence of monopoly price? He says, first, there has to be a monopoly of supply. There has to be one firm, okay, that owns the entire supply of the specific resource. In this case, one firm owning either all the diamond mines or all the copper mines. Now, Mises believes that this is very, very rare in the real world. He basically mentions possibly diamond mines, okay? It's extremely rare. And mercury I guess, is also very, very scarce. So it could happen with mercury or diamond mines. He goes on to say that the second condition is that the demand curve above the competitive price must be inelastic, meaning that at a higher price you must be able to generate a higher total revenue. Now, what if above $5 people cut back sufficiently on the amount of output that they were producing that you wouldn't have total revenue at any higher price, let's say above $480 million? Would it be beneficial even for the sole owner of that copper mine to restrict supply? No, because he's earning the maximum total revenue at $5. Okay, so those are the two conditions. Okay, there has to be sole ownership of a specific resource, okay, and that's a very rare, difficult condition to fulfill. And secondly, even if that's the case, you still might not get a monopoly price because of the elasticity of the demand curve. In other words, there could be substitute products, closed substitutes that people could turn to. All right.